They thought humanity was finished. That the silence after Earth's fall meant we would never rise again. But in hidden shipyards, black ships were reborn. We reclaimed our worlds, system by system. We weren't here to conquer the galaxy. We were here to protect our people. The human empire rises again, not as tyrants, but as guardians. And this time, we will never be forgotten. There was a time when humanity stood tall among the stars, a time when the banner of Earth fluttered on every colony, on every world where human footsteps pressed into alien soil, where the breath of human lungs tested the thin air of newly terraformed atmospheres. There was a time when the human empire was not just a name whispered with awe or fear, but a reality that pulsed with the ambition of billions, a living network of trade, culture, and unyielding will that spanned the darkness between suns. But that time ended. It did not end with a grand war, though there were wars enough. It did not end with a cataclysmic explosion, though worlds burned and cities turned to glass under bombardment. It ended as empires often do, not with a scream, but with a sigh. The human empire had spread too far, too quickly, its hunger outpacing its strength, its arrogance blinding it to the cracks forming within its foundations. Greed and corruption seeped into the councils that once guided the expansion, into the admirals who once commanded the fleets that patrolled the void, into the governors who once spoke for the distant worlds under the empire's protection. And so, while humanity built monuments that touched the clouds, while its fleets sailed the currents of hyperspace, the seeds of decay grew unnoticed. The empire fractured. Worlds that once sent tribute to Earth turned inward, hoarding resources as trade faltered, as piracy grew along the lanes that had once been safe. Fleets that once stood as guardians of peace turned into weapons of conquest as admirals carved out their own petty dominions. The laws of the empire became meaningless on the edges of its reach, where distant colonies were left to fend for themselves, where alien powers probed the weakening borders, sensing the slow collapse of a giant once feared. Earth, the cradle of humanity, became a symbol of a forgotten promise. Its leaders, trapped in endless debates and corrupt dealings, watched helplessly as the empire slipped from their grasp. The beacons that once guided travelers across the stars flickered and died, the embassies and trade stations abandoned, the alliances formed over centuries reduced to memories. And then, at last, the empire fell. The collapse came slowly, like a rot spreading through the veins of a great tree, until it could no longer stand under its own weight. The fleets vanished, the trade routes fell silent, the colonies became isolated fragments of a civilization that no longer existed. The core worlds turned inwards, closing themselves off from the chaos at the edges, and Earth became silent. The silence stretched for centuries. In the darkness of that silence, humanity was forgotten. The galaxy moved on. Alien empires, once held at bay by the human empire's fleets, expanded into the void left behind, claiming systems and sectors, establishing trade networks that no longer included humanity. On the worlds where humans still lived, they became subjects of alien rulers, second-class citizens on the planets their ancestors had once claimed, remnants of a fallen empire that no longer commanded respect. There were still those who remembered. On distant worlds, in hidden enclaves, in the archives of abandoned stations, the memory of the human empire remained. Stories told by grandparents to children about the time when humanity was strong, when the ships of Earth ruled the lanes of hyperspace, when no power in the galaxy dared to challenge the will of the human race. But those stories were fading. Humanity was fading. Until, in the silence, something changed. It began not with a fleet rising from the ashes, not with a grand declaration, but with a spark, a whisper moving across the remnants of the old empire, a whisper that became a promise that became a plan. There were those who still remembered the old ways, who still remembered the technologies that had once made humanity a force unmatched in the galaxy. Engineers who had spent lifetimes maintaining ancient machines in the dark corners of abandoned stations, scientists who had preserved knowledge in hidden data vaults beneath the surfaces of dying worlds, soldiers who had never stopped training, who kept the flame of duty alive even as the empire crumbled around them. They gathered, quietly, across the shattered remnants of the empire. In hidden shipyards orbiting dead moons, in underground bunkers beneath toxic skies, in the cold depths of abandoned asteroid mines, they gathered. They took the relics of the past, the broken hulls of forgotten warships, the rusted frames of abandoned starfighters, the data cores containing the blueprints of weapons long thought lost, and they rebuilt. They did not seek permission, for there was no authority left to grant it. They did not wait for consensus, for the time for debate was over. They did not seek peace, for peace had never been given to them, only taken from them by the indifferent advance of the galaxy's empires. They sought only one thing, to make humanity strong again. And so the long work began. In the dark of space, hidden from the eyes of those who now ruled the galaxy, they rebuilt the engines of war. They reforged the armor of ancient warships, replacing rust with alloys stronger than anything the old empire had ever known. They reawakened the artificial minds once banned by decrees of a council that no longer existed, integrating them into the systems of the rebuilt ships, giving them minds sharper than the fastest pilots, reflexes quicker than the most skilled soldiers. They rearmed themselves with weapons powered by the cores of collapsed stars, weapons capable of tearing apart the shields of the ships that now patrolled the galaxy, weapons that could turn fortresses into dust, that could erase the defenses of entire worlds in moments. And as they built, they remembered. They remembered the pride of a humanity that had once looked at the stars and saw not obstacles, but opportunities. They remembered the courage of the explorers who had ventured into the dark, not knowing if they would ever return. They remembered the strength of the soldiers who had once defended humanity's right to exist in a galaxy that had never been kind, never been fair, never been safe. They remembered, and they swore an oath in the silence of that rebuilding. Humanity would rise again. They did not seek vengeance for the fall of the empire, for the empire had fallen by its own hand. They did not seek to conquer the galaxy, for conquest had proven to be a hollow victory. They sought only to reclaim the dignity of humanity, to restore its place among the stars, to ensure that never again would humanity be forgotten. And so, in the hidden places of the galaxy, the first ships of the new human empire rose. They were not announced with fanfare, not revealed with parades or proclamations. They rose quietly, engines lighting the darkness of abandoned docks, hulls gliding through the void like shadows reborn. They tested their systems in silence, calibrated their weapons without witness, plotted their courses through the hyperspace lanes that had not seen human traffic in centuries. And then, when they were ready, they moved. They did not strike at the galaxy in anger, did not lash out in blind violence. They moved with purpose, reclaiming the outposts and stations that had once belonged to humanity, removing the pirates and warlords who had filled the void left by the empire's collapse. They liberated the human enclaves on worlds where they had become subjects, not with words, but with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who had prepared for this moment for generations. Each victory was a spark in the darkness. On distant worlds, human communities watched as the black ships descended from the sky, as the alien overseers who had ruled them fled or fell, as the banners of Earth were raised once more, not as a symbol of tyranny, but as a promise that humanity would not be forgotten. The sparks became embers, the embers became flames, and the flames became a fire that began to spread. The new human empire did not declare itself with empty speeches. It declared itself in action, in the liberation of one world after another, in the quiet restoration of humanity's dignity, in the steady reclamation of the stars that humanity had once believed were theirs to explore, to live upon, to call home. The galaxy took notice. At first, they dismissed it as another rebellion, another faction rising from the ashes of the old empire, doomed to fail as so many had before. But as the victories continued, as the black ships of the human empire moved from system to system, as worlds fell under their protection rather than their rule, the galaxy began to understand. This was not a rebellion. This was a resurrection. The human empire was rising again, not as it had been before, bloated with arrogance and corruption, but as it was meant to be, a guardian of humanity, a protector of its right to exist in a galaxy that had tried to erase it, a force that would ensure that humanity would never again be subject to the whims of empires that saw them as less, as expendable, as a species that could be ignored or subjugated. And so the galaxy watched as the human empire rose from the silence of its own extinction. They watched as the fleets grew, as the worlds once abandoned became beacons of hope, as the trade lanes reopened under the protection of human warships that asked for nothing in return but the promise that humanity would be respected. They watched, and they began to understand, the human empire rises again. The galaxy had grown used to the absence of humanity. In the centuries of silence that followed the empire's collapse, new powers had risen in the void it left behind. Trade routes that once rang with human voices became dominated by alien tongues and alien ships. Laws were written without consideration for the species that had once enforced its will across the stars, treaties signed that divided territories where human colonies had once thrived. The galaxy had moved on, building itself around the quiet assumption that humanity was no longer a factor, that it had passed into irrelevance, that the whispers of Earth's fallen glory were nothing but stories told by those who could not let go of the past. But now, in the darkness of deep space, the assumptions of the galaxy began to fracture. The new human empire did not arrive with grand proclamations or desperate pleas for recognition. It arrived as a quiet, implacable presence, a slow and inevitable advance that no fleet could stop, no council could negotiate away, no empire could intimidate. At first, it was a handful of systems reclaimed from lawlessness, pirate kings and local warlords removed with clinical precision, their black markets shut down, their captives freed. The new human empire did not leave behind puppet governors or demand tribute. It left behind stability, the reopening of trade, the protection of human settlements and those who wished to live in peace. The galaxy mistook this restraint for weakness. They believed that the human empire would be satisfied with reclaiming a few worlds, a few routes, a few forgotten enclaves where humanity still struggled to survive. They believed that the return of humanity would be another flicker of rebellion in a galaxy that had seen countless uprisings, countless failed revolutions that ended in ashes. They did not understand what was happening. Because the new human empire was not seeking conquest, but restoration. It was not seeking glory, but dignity. It was not seeking dominance, but survival. And so it continued to expand, system by system, quietly, efficiently, with the same patience that had guided it through the centuries of silence that followed the fall of Earth's rule. It did not spread with fire and destruction, but with the steady momentum of a people who had already experienced extinction, who knew what it meant to lose everything, and who would not allow that to happen again. The black ships of the human empire moved along the forgotten lanes of hyperspace, routes once thought too dangerous to traverse, emerging above worlds where human settlements still struggled under the rule of indifferent or oppressive powers. The ships descended, and the rulers who had grown fat on the suffering of others found themselves facing a force they could not bribe, could not threaten, could not ignore. The human empire came not as conquerors, but as liberators. On every world, the same pattern emerged. The black ships would arrive, their engines humming softly in the skies. They would land, and the rulers who had grown accustomed to their power would be removed, quickly, quietly, with no spectacle, no drawn-out battles. The human empire did not waste time on speeches or debates. It acted, and then it moved on, leaving behind communities freed to govern themselves, trade lanes reopened, and the promise of protection against those who would seek to enslave them again. Slowly, the galaxy began to understand. This was not a rebellion. This was not a faction rising for its own gain. This was the return of humanity, the reawakening of a people who had once touched every corner of the galaxy, who had once looked into the dark and refused to be afraid, who had once believed that the stars belonged to everyone willing to reach for them. The new human empire did not claim ownership over the galaxy, but it would not allow the galaxy to claim ownership over humanity. And as it expanded, it grew stronger. Every world freed became a node in the growing network of the new empire. Trade began to flow again, not through the sanctioned routes of the established empires, but along the paths protected by human ships. The goods of 100 worlds began to move under the watch of the black fleets, fueling the forges of hidden shipyards, the refineries of reclaimed stations, the development of technologies once lost to the collapse of the old empire. With every world reclaimed, with every route secured, the human empire gathered strength. It was not a sudden surge of power, not an explosive expansion fueled by conquest and fear, but a steady accumulation of capability and resilience. It was a return to the practices that had once made humanity strong, the willingness to innovate, to adapt, to rebuild, to learn from failure, to move forward no matter how dark the path. The galaxy had forgotten what that looked like. They remembered the human empire that fell, bloated with arrogance, corrupted by greed, divided by infighting. They remembered the wars of conquest, the heavy boots of occupation, the fleets that came to demand tribute and obedience. They had never seen the human empire that was forged in the ashes of extinction. They had never seen the human empire that rose not to dominate, but to protect. And so, as the black ship spread across the stars, the galaxy struggled to respond. Some empires attempted to resist, sending fleets to confront the human empire, to drive it back from the systems it had reclaimed. They came with ships built for intimidation, armed with weapons designed to inspire fear, crewed by soldiers trained to enforce the will of rulers who believed in their own superiority. They came to fight an empire they thought was seeking conquest. They did not find one. The human empire did not seek war, but it did not flee from it. The black ships met the fleets of the galaxy with cold precision, not with the fury of conquerors, but with the determination of protectors. Battles were fought, but they were short, decisive, efficient. The tactics of the human empire were not built around victory for glory, but around minimizing loss, preserving life, ensuring that the ships and worlds reclaimed would be left whole, ready to join the growing network of stability. They fought, not for conquest, but to end the fighting as quickly as possible. And they won. Because they were not driven by arrogance, or greed, or the hunger for power that blinded so many of the galaxy's rulers. They were driven by purpose, by necessity, by the understanding that humanity could not afford to lose, that every defeat was a step back towards extinction, that every victory was a step forward towards survival. The galaxy learned. Some tried to negotiate, to offer alliances, to establish treaties that would keep the human empire confined to its reclaimed territories. They came with promises, with deals, with proposals that would secure their own power while limiting the growth of humanity's resurgence. The human empire listened, but it did not bend. It did not seek conflict, but it would not allow itself to be contained. The galaxy learned that the human empire could not be intimidated, could not be bribed, could not be stopped. And so, as the years passed, the black ships continued to move, system by system, world by world, reclaiming the remnants of humanity scattered across the stars, protecting them, rebuilding them, connecting them. Trade flourished under the protection of the human empire's fleets, not because it demanded tribute, but because it provided security. The colonies once isolated and dying became prosperous again, their people able to focus on building, creating, exploring, rather than simply surviving. New ships were built, new engines developed, new technologies deployed to heal the wounds of the past and open pathways into the future. And with each world reclaimed, with each route secured, with each community stabilized, the human empire grew, not as a conqueror consuming the galaxy, but as a protector ensuring that the galaxy could no longer consume humanity. And slowly, the galaxy began to accept the new reality. They began to see the human empire not as a threat, but as a stabilizing force in a galaxy that had grown accustomed to chaos. Worlds that had once feared the return of human power found themselves welcoming the arrival of black ships, knowing that with them came protection, trade, and the promise that they would not be abandoned if they asked for help. The human empire became a beacon in the darkness. It became a reminder that humanity would not fade into silence. It became proof that extinction was not the end, that collapse was not forever, that from the ashes of the past, something stronger, wiser, and more determined could rise. It became a promise to every human child born on distant worlds that they would never be alone, that they would never be forgotten, that the stars would always hold a place for them, no matter how dark the galaxy might become. And so, the human empire rose again. Not as it once was, bloated with arrogance and conquest, but as it was meant to be, a guardian of humanity's right to exist, a protector of its dignity, a force that would ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. And in the dark, quiet corners of the galaxy, in the halls of power where rulers once mocked humanity's weakness, in the councils where strategies were formed, a new understanding spread. The human empire had returned. And it would never be forgotten again. Like, comment, and subscribe if you love these long HFY stories. It supports the channel and lets me bring you more epic sci-fi.